For decades, their incredible heroism was a total secret. Their stories were locked away, classified by the U.S. government. But in 1969, that silence was finally shattered at a reunion that would completely change how we think about World War II. This is the story of that day, and the recognition that took way too long to come.
So, picture this. It's 1969, in a hotel ballroom in Chicago. This is the first time the Navajo code talkers have ever had a reunion, and for the very first time in public, these men are wearing their Marine uniforms. They're older now, of course, but the memories are as sharp as ever. And after all those years, they are finally allowed to speak.
I mean, can you even imagine the weight of that moment? You read the accounts and they describe old men, proud Marines, just weeping as they shared what they'd been forced to lock away for over 20 years. Their families, their kids, their grandkids who only knew them as farmers or shepherds were finally hearing the truth, that these were the men whose secret, unbreakable code was the key to victory in the Pacific.
And that really is the central question, isn't it? Why were these national heroes forced to stay completely silent for nearly a quarter of a century after the war was over? Well, the answer really shows you the devastating cost of a national secret.
So the war ends in 1945, but for the Code Talkers, a whole different kind of battle was just starting. They were sworn to absolute secrecy. We're talking unable to tell anyone, not their wives, not their doctors, what they really did, under the threat of treason.
23 years. Let that sink in for a minute. That is an entire generation, a lifetime of holding in the trauma, the pride, and the unbelievable truth of what they accomplished. And this silence, it wasn't just about not telling stories. It had a deep, spiritual cost.
This created what experts call moral injury. You see, in Dene or Navajo culture, there are traditional ceremonies for warriors returning from battle. One is called the enemy way, and it's meant to cleanse the trauma of war and help them rejoin the community. But to do it, you have to talk about what happened. The government secrecy order made that sacred healing process completely impossible.
And this just lays out the cruel irony of their situation. On one hand, these men came home carrying one of the nation's most important secrets. On the other hand, they returned to a country that, in a lot of ways, didn't even see them as full citizens. They couldn't even vote in states like Arizona and New Mexico until 1948. Publicly, they were marginalized. Secretly, they were heroes.
And you know, the cost wasn't just psychological, not by a long shot. The secrecy had real, devastating economic consequences that basically locked an entire generation of heroes right out of the American dream.
Okay, so here's how this went down. The GI Bill was literally creating the American middle class. But to get those benefits, a home loan, money for college, you had to show your service record. The Code Talkers couldn't. Their real job, radio operator, was top secret, so their official records were changed to something vague, like basic infantry, or in some cases, even janitors. The result? Many were denied the very benefits meant to thank them for their service, which prevented them from building generational wealth for their families.
So after 23 years of this unbelievable sacrifice, what finally changed? Why in 1968 was the secret suddenly declassified, letting that reunion in Chicago happen?
Well, the answer, when you dig into the records, it's not what you'd hope for. It wasn't some moral awakening. It wasn't a decision to finally do right by these men. It was just a cold, pragmatic calculation.
The secret simply wasn't valuable anymore. With new encryption technology, computers, satellites, the military just didn't need a human-based, unwritten code. So the program was declassified for one reason and one reason only. It had become obsolete.
And all of that brings us right back to that ballroom in Chicago. When you understand the full context of that 23-year silence, the pain, the sacrifice, that reunion becomes this incredibly powerful moment of cultural validation.
You see, you have to understand, many of these same men had been sent to government boarding schools when they were kids, and in those schools they were brutally punished for speaking their native language, for speaking Navajo, that have their mouths washed out with soap. They were taught that their language and their culture were worthless.
And then, just a few years later, the very same government that tried to beat that language out of them came to them, desperate. They needed that forbidden language to win the war. The language that was a source of punishment in school became the unbreakable code that helped save the world. So that reunion wasn't just about telling war stories. It was about reclaiming the dignity of a culture and a language that had been suppressed.
This whole story, it just forces you to step back and ask some much bigger questions, right? Questions about history, memory, and what justice really looks like.
Who gets to decide which stories get told, and when? Just look at this timeline. It lays it all out, and it's staggering. Look at those gaps. It took until 1982 just to get a National Day of Recognition, and it wasn't until 2001, 56 years after the war ended, that they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medals. By that point, most of the original code talkers who invented the code were already gone. It really makes you ask, is justice delayed? Justice denied?
And that leaves us right here with this incredibly powerful question. The story of the Code Talkers is just this stark reminder of the very real human cost of state secrets. It forces all of us to think about where we draw the line between the security of a nation and the right of an individual to own their own story, their own trauma, and their own history. And that's a question that's just as relevant today as it was back in 1945.